Most young and ambitious people struggle with choosing a path and finding directionality. And it's not because we don't have any idea. Typically, we have a rough idea of the things that we want, but we also tend to look at things in the wrong way because everything that you want to do professionally or the way in which you want to make a living ultimately comes down to one of two different paths. But the problem, especially when you're young, you're graduating school or you're coming out of high school, or you're maybe wanting to take a little bit of a career pivot, the biggest issue is that you just feel overwhelmed because there's too many choices. And so it keeps us stuck in analysis paralysis because we're trying to pick the perfect job instead of just understanding the essence of what that role does and what the role plays in the bigger picture of things. And so, what I have found, at least what worked for myself in terms of the solution, is instead of focusing on job titles or industries or what's in demand or what's gonna make money, what's the high income skills, you should focus on the fundamental role that you want to play in the story of your work, right? So every job, no matter the industry, essentially falls into one of two categories. You have producers, which are the builders, the creators, and the revenue generators. And then you have supporters, and these are the enablers, the strategists, and the optimizers of the system. And once you know which one fits you best, the rest of your career decisions and the path that you decide to take becomes infinitely easier. So, what's a producer? Producers create the raw materials or the raw inputs that ultimately fuel a business. They generate the revenue, the products, content, and the intellectual property. And so the examples of this is going to be salespeople, entrepreneurs, engineers, writers, designers, content creators, artists, and like developers. So the things that directly go into the business that create stuff. And so the key traits to this is going to be what tends to be a little bit higher risk. There's direct value creation there. There's pretty close to immediate financial upside. And often these are individual contributor focused roles early on in your career. Now, on the other side, you have supporters. And so supporters figure out how those raw materials get used efficiently. And so these supporters typically are there to optimize systems, organize teams, and make sure that things can scale properly or scale at levels that the business or the business owner or whatever wants to get to. And so the examples of these are going to be your project managers, operational leaders, finance, HR, marketing, and a lot of times also consultants. And so the traits of these supporters are typically going to be more things around system thinking, long-term growth, scaling efficiency, and whenever it comes to the financial upside, typically it's delayed, but over time, the financial upside goes up dramatically. And so what you have to understand is it does not matter which path that you choose to take because both are necessary for success. So no business works without both. Producers may drive the actions, but supporters make sure that the machine doesn't break or that the wheels don't fall off. And so it's easy to see examples of this, like if you think about this in terms of the second law of thermodynamics, that systems naturally go into disorder unless acted upon by an external force. So even though a lot of times producers get the credit and it's the sexier thing, it wouldn't be able to work without the supporting roles. And so your job as a supporter is to make sure that the system doesn't fall apart. Or in the case, let's look at water. Water goes in infinite directions and has no purpose until it's put into a container, until it has that specific purpose. And so then as you understand this, then you have to add, how do you know which path is going to be right for you? And so what you first have to understand is it's not about the job. It's about the role that you play in your career story. So stop thinking of careers as a list of job titles or responsibilities that you had, and instead start to ask yourself, what kind of role do I tend to naturally play? This is your career archetype. This isn't just a job. And so how do you know if you are a producer or a supporter? Well, if you want to make money fast and thrive in an environment of uncertainty, then you want to go producer. If you're more risk averse, but you love structure and scaling things properly and optimizing, go with more of the supporter role. And now there's a way that you can gut check this. So when you think about solving problems, do you focus on making something happen, which this is going to be more the producer, or do you focus on how to improve what's already happening or what's already working? From there, you're going to know maybe you have more of a proclivity towards being a supporter role. And so let's look at this in the grand scheme of things, in the actual world. So imagine you're at a startup. The producer is the one who's selling, who's building, and who's ultimately like creating the product. Now, the supporter is setting up the systems, the hiring, and making sure that everything runs smoothly. So it's essentially making the producer's job easier so that the supporter's job gets easier by bringing in the right people, by making sure that the systems have consistent feedback loops and positive feedback loops. And so both, whichever way you decide to go, both can become equally successful. But they do take different roads to the top. But ultimately, like what you need to do as a young professional, as you are trying to figure out what the hell you're going to do for a living and make money with in the world, and you know you want to be successful, you just need some form of directionality and you need to go down one path or the other. Because eventually you're going to cross both and you're going to need both to become an effective leader. It doesn't mean you have to master both, but it does mean you're going to have to work a little bit in each to be able to do that. And so from my experience, I started as a producer, even though my natural proclivity was towards supporting, right? However, I needed faster money with all the college debt that I had coming out of school. And I knew that sales was a higher income potential faster. That's the only reason I ultimately ended up taking it. But what that led to is my ability to be an effective producer, because it doesn't mean that you're going to be bad at it. It's just what do you naturally tend to get energy from? I found my way into being an operational leader. And now I help operate a $7+ million a year company. And now because I understand the production aspect, I am that much better in my role because I see how every part of the business actually works. And so every great leader needs to master both. So if you want to make it to the top, you will eventually need to understand both roles. And if you look like through military history and stuff, a lot of the greatest generals were foot soldiers at one point. They were the producers in the case of the military. They were the ones on the front line. And then by the time that they were able to step into a more strategist type of role, a more supporting type role in being an officer, they were able to relate to frontline soldiers more. And so because they also knew the environment that they were in, they were able to adjust strategy accordingly. So even if you start as a producer, you'll need supporter skills to be able to scale. And as a salesperson, this is going to be setting up proper systems for your pipeline and making sure that you have systems to consistently follow up with people and make sure that you always have a consistent flow of deals or revenue coming through. And even if you start as a supporter, you will need producer skills in order to be able to lead and drive action from people below you. And so now you have to start seeing your career, like your career journey. It is your hero's journey of work. And so every successful person or every hero follows a similar arc, right? So act one, you pick one and you do everything you can to master it. And you start by leaning heavily into whether you're a producer or a supporter. And then it's going to take you into act two, which is you learn the other side. So once you have the necessary experience on one end, you start developing some skills from the other bucket. And then once you're in act three, you can start to become a pseudo master of both. And at the top, the best leaders understand both creation and optimization. And so there's a few people throughout history that we've all heard of, that we think about this. Steve Jobs. He was a producer who later became more of a strategic supporter. So he learned everything he needed to learn about, computers and everything like that. And then he became the strategist. He became the visionary behind it and knew how to set up the system in Apple accordingly. Elon Musk learned eventually how to systematize his businesses from the raw ideas that he had. Okay. And so most successful people that you look at, they were able to figure all of these things out along the way and were able to master both. And so if you can break things down into these two silos, it makes it a hell of a lot less overwhelming for you to be able to ultimately figure out which direction should you take. Now, how do we start to figure out what your next move is? And so the first is just to identify your natural leaning. Look at your past experiences. When you work on a project, are you the one who's typically building the thing, like set or selling it? Or are you better at working with other people to figure out how can you do things fast? Like, oh, we should do this to do this faster, or this might be a better use of our time, or figuring out like assigning people tasks, like who should do what. Typically in school, when you have group projects, you kind of start to have ideas about this and you kind of know which path you tend to gravitate more towards. And so you also need to align it with your life goals. So if, like I mentioned earlier, I needed more money faster out of college. So if you need money quicker just to get into a better spot financially, producer, at least from my experience, is going to be, you're going to have a higher likelihood of hitting those goals earlier on. But if you're in a place where you can play a little bit longer of a game, then supporter can lead to just as much success. It might take a little bit more maneuvering internally, like politically at some companies. And it's typically just a slower work to the top since a lot of results aren't always directly correlated to you in the same way that being a producer is. And so over time, you need to start developing both. So whichever one you choose, just make sure that you gradually build some skills from the other side. So like I mentioned, whenever I was in sales, yes, I was pretty focused on revenue, cold calling, just getting as many appointments as possible. But over time, I started to develop skills of like, hey, this is a follow-up cadence that I can have, and I can set up some automations in my own name or in my own CRM that will consistently make sure I'm following up with people on a regular cadence so that it's not wasting my mental energy. Because one of the big things as producers is you're usually utilizing a ton of mental energy and you run into a lot of mental fatigue. And so having some of those supporting skills or those supporting role skills is going to be able to help you produce more anyway. And this type of thinking is what's eventually going to make you into a leader, right? So at the end of the day, like every job that you'll ever do falls into one of these two categories. And once you understand this and you can actually internalize it, the career or professional decision-making process becomes a lot simpler. And at this stage, especially if you're young and ambitious, your job isn't to chase a perfect career, the thing that you're going to do with the rest of your life. It's to understand the role that you play in the bigger story of your career. And once you pick your path, your only job is to get really damn good at it.